Hello, hi Zena.
Hello, Tatiana. Nice to see you.
So good to have you with me, and hello to listeners. I'm really excited about starting those LinkedIn Live series on embracing intensity. And today is the first one with amazing Zena Everett, who is a leadership coach, and she's an author of 3 books, and actually very famous books, Crazy Busy Cure. And Zina and I have been discussing and speaking about what is actually intensity. And I'm so excited to have Zina here with me. So, Zina, and I know we just been discussing that we have different views on intensity. It means slightly different things, as words sometimes mean different things to different people. So let's start with me describing what intensity means to me. So for me, intensity, it's a particular type of presence. So, the leaders who have been described or relate to themselves as intense leaders, they have this energetic presence that they are noticeable. For example, for me, sometimes I was in some meetings where I didn't say much. And some people would comment, oh, Tatiana have been quite dominating. And that has always risen a question for me. What does it actually mean? And then, of course, as I told you, I was have been called intense my whole life. And that's hence from that place, I started reflecting on the subject, when it's a healthy intensity and when it's toxic intensity. So intensity is a certain presence for me. It is the ability to have this singular focus on something. It is a level of perseverance. It is a level of perceived power, even to some extent. And so how does it resonate with you? What comes up for you when somebody is called an intense leader?
Well, I've never heard anybody called an intense leader. I'm looking at a definition here. So the Oxford English Dictionary says intensity means of extreme force. So degree or strength, i.e. the job demands intense concentration, and also having or showing strong feelings or opinions. So I suppose somebody being very earnest or serious. So I'm kind of wondering, why would somebody say Tatiana's very intense if you haven't actually said anything in a meeting? I mean, what were you doing that somebody would say, you said nothing, but you're still very intense? How would they know?
Well, it might be that I said 1 or 2 sentences, and that's why
Okay, that's got them. Yeah.
And but not kind of a prolonged explanations. And that's why it is this particular energetic presence, so that's what when I was reflecting about that. And and you're right, that is extreme force. And for me it's also the question, when does it lead to toxicity and when does it lead to positive impact, i.e. what I call healthy intensity. And for me, the biggest differentiator is ability to trust in oneself and connection to purpose. So why? Because I believe that people trust themselves and believe in themselves, there is nothing to prove. So you see, when somebody has a very strong energetic presence and underneath they're trying to prove something to themselves or to others, it can very much show up as defense, as pushing against something. And that can easily lead to quite a toxic impact on the environment. So, and in the same way...
Can you illustrate that with an example? I think that would be really helpful. Just like an imaginary case study of how that would show out.
Yeah.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I can even think of some of situations in my early career when,
Yeah.
for example, I would be very much connected with like, um, we need to sell this transaction, or even in management consulting, we're working on this project and we need to produce and deliver this message in a particular way. And if underneath I'm still in a stage where I'm not completely sure about myself or doubt myself, it's like every comment that I receive, I would counteract, and because I have this strong presence and ability to push through, can come across, sometimes even as a bulldozer. And on some occasion, when I was particularly when I was particularly felt under pressure like this, somebody might have described to me, "Oh, Tatiana is a little bit like a bulldozer, right?" Or not even a little bit. So, and
Okay.
it comes
But
from
you mean you've been
one.
tasked to do something and you just go ahead and make it happen, and maybe you've ruffled a few feathers on the way.
True.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it's okay to ruffle feathers on the way. It's like, does it come from the place of trying to prove, something to someone? Because the difference is, say, if in those when I was, or when I am, or when I'm aware of being in healthy intensity, of observing the leaders who are more in healthy intensity, it's this ability to be okay with being wrong. And it's
Yeah.
also this ability to slow down and to listen.
Okay. I see what you mean. Okay. I get it. Yeah. I've never thought about intensity in that way. I've never used, I mean, it's just semantics, but that seems to me that you were in I imagine, a fairly dog eat dog environment, and you had to achieve objectives, and that's what you were wound up, and no better woman for the job, set off to do it. And you just made it happen, and you bulldozed your way through, because that's probably what you were rewarded on doing. But along the way, you ruffled a few feathers, and people they probably said quite a lot of things. And one of the most polite one was, "Oh, Tatiana's very intense." Is that fair?
And you know what? It's like, and for some people, that was also one of the reasons why I was really promoted, and why, and if you imagine a girl coming from former Soviet Union, making a way through on her own in the Western society, in investment banking,
Yeah.
it's being so focused on a particular purpose, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you're driven, actually.
The
So
drive
maybe
is part of intensity.
it's toxic. It's going into overdrive drive. I see. So it's when okay. So my version of intensity is focus. And I think
Okay.
I think what we're talking about here is when, do you know Marshall Goldsmith's "What got you here won't get you there"? But credit to Marshall, 8 minutes in already. And I really love that, where your real strengths, which get you to a certain level in life, which got you out of the Soviet Union into these incredible high banking jobs, absolutely tough environments, and you thrived in them. So what you're saying is exactly his shtick, that when you have too much of a good thing, it tips into overdrive. That starts to be a problem. But you see, I don't think that's a personality thing necessarily. I think it's a system. So my productivity work, which feeds into this, as in deep work and stuff. But I see people who work very intensely, but that's because they're in systems that require that. I don't see it as necessarily a personality trait. So let me ask you then, let's take you out of the banking environment, which you've successfully done. Do you think that you still maintain that intensity in your coaching career?
Yes, and as you see, it was also going into my private life, and that's what, like, our children are often our biggest mirror, right? So when I asked my daughter, I remember when she was young,
Okay.
I said, Anna, what do you think? When would you describe your mommy as intense? And she was like, oh my gosh, you're so intense.
Yeah.
And that's like 8 years old child speaking at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But what did
it's
she mean? Why did she? Well, why did you ask her?
well, because when you're labeled at work as intense, it's quite curious to know how do I come across at home. And also, I remember at that time I was reflecting, oh my gosh, if I make this impact on adult men, I wonder how my child feels about that.
Maybe you
It
should ask
must
your
be, right? It must be a lot to grow up with a mom who likes so intense, right? And I think
But
that
that's focus. Do you mean that? Does that mean, are we talking here about singular focus? Because that's what intense means to me. Is intensity I see as deep work. So when you
yes,
asked me to come on here, I thought, right, what do I know about intensity? For me, that's flow. That's deep work. That's a period of intense working, 90 minutes, no coffee breaks, no bathroom breaks, no phones, no distractions, just deep focused work. That's
mhm,
that's
mhm,
that's
yes,
where
yes,
intensity shows out, and maybe a sort of an intense passion for some peculiar aspects of history or something that you can bore everybody in the pub with. But what you're talking about is kind of, you're talking about a singular focus and maybe a preoccupation with something, are you? That's unnecessarily deep.
and it's not always unnecessarily deep. It might be necessarily deep, and it's also like, say, you mentioned intense periods of work. I also believe it also applies to intense way of being, right? So it's kind of like, for some people it might be feeling intensely. For some other people it might be being like really about in a physical way, right? About like ultra marathons. So it's
Yeah.
it's everything becomes of high importance in the moment, right? So that's why it is this particular energetic presence, and it's not good or bad. It
Yeah.
just is
So
what
we're
is
talking about hyper focus. We're talking about hyper
hyper.
focus, aren't we?
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Okay. But so I would see that as just a really, really good thing. I see it with my clients. Often neurodiversity plays into this a bit. So, but what were you being hyper focused on that your daughter thought, yeah, mum, you're too intense? You were hyper focused on her results or her diet or her
and
whatever.
even in a conversation, so it's like it's taking a deep, right? Okay, like, if we speak about your feelings, let's speak properly about your feelings. If we
Oh,
discuss that subject, let's discuss the subject. It's kind of almost might be sometimes not being able to stay on a superficial level, but
yeah.
the whole thing is how connected it is with a particular focus, with a particular purpose. That's for me, that's also important distinction of healthy intensity
Yeah.
versus, say, toxic intensity, the connection with a purpose and awareness of the impact.
Yeah.
So
Okay. And yeah. Okay. So you mean the context, there's a time and a place for hyper focus, and maybe interviewing somebody at length over dinner at a dinner party or something, or in the pub or whatever, first date, whatever it is not the time and place.
yes, it's being aware of one's impact. And
Yeah.
also you see this difference if we go in super focus with that, like, of super focus, while being quite secure in oneself and trusting self, then there is straight away more openness to what is outside. Like, it's like it's getting out of this tunnel vision and opening the periphery vision as well.
So what would you have said to your young self then when you got that feedback back in the bank that you are intense? And I presume that was a too intense. What do you wish you'd known then?
I wish I wish I took a moment to slow down. And it's a great question, by the way, Zina. I really like it. I took the moment to slow down and reflect. Okay, am I aware of how this energy impacts me and impacts people around me? And what is actually my why? Consciously, what's my why of applying that energy?
Yeah. And if you'd been able to do that, what would you have done differently? What would people have noticed different about you?
What if people would have noticed differently? Well, they probably, in some situations, they might have noticed more calmness.
Right. Yeah.
And might be more, well, let's put it blank, might be sometimes more compassion also to different ways of doing things. And you know what? Don't take me wrong. It was often positive because, you know, when I spoke recently to one of my former bosses, he said it is like you had this amazing singular focus and you were able to take people on a journey with you. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not like, you know, but would there be people who are upset in the process? Yes. And would there be opportunities that might have not been noticed? But I'm really curious to hear, what about you? So, you know, you were interested in this subject. And of course, you know, even if we come to it from a different angles to that subject. Now, when we speak about this toxic and healthy intensity, when do you feel you are in healthy intensity?
I think what I'm doing, I wrote a deck for something I'm doing next week, and I spent a couple of hours on it this morning, and I didn't interrupt myself. I had a timer on to start and a timer on to stop, and I just got on with it. So for me, intensity is deep working. And you know, I work in a world where, you know, looking at what people do all day, it's kind of real interesting, crazy busyness and how we're all distracted and we're switch tasking. So for me, from a system perspective, I think people, no matter how much, how maybe we have intensity tendencies, I think it's very difficult to work in an intense way, actually, because we're distracted constantly. So even, you know, how we used to read the Sunday papers, I don't know how we used to do it, sit down for 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday with a pot of coffee and it was all lovely. Even that seems to be really hard now because our brains are just hardwired to be switching from one thing to another. And we're used to, you know, we're just used to getting information in sound bites, aren't we? You know, I doubt very many people will be able to have the time or the focus to listen to us, just listen to this for half an hour. So for me, I think we don't get enough opportunities for intensity. And I think the other stuff that you're talking about is kind of self-awareness and just learning to think, okay, this is how I work, but maybe I need to say, it really made me think about this, Tatiana, but to maybe people need to be able to say, look, I need to work really intensely on something. And I may forget to be as polite as I could do. And I may be a bit abrupt and, you know, perfunctory in the way I respond to messages. This is the way I work. Can we talk about how you work? And, you know, so I think we need to have many of the more conversations at work to allow people to work to their best endeavors. And I reckon that your boss might have thought, boy, Tatiana might be more intense than the rest of us and she might ruffle a few feathers, but, you know, look at where we are as a consequence of that. So maybe instead of it being seen as a bad thing, you know, I don't like this whole idea of vanillaizing people, how we work. I think it's great to have people, whether or not they're neurodiverse, because that does play into hyperfocus, but actually just to say, this is how I'm going to do my best work and please let me get on with it. And I'll try and be as mindful of other people as I possibly can, but, you know, use me in the best possible way to use our objectives. I don't think it's something necessarily that we should apologize for. I think I've gone around in circles there and contradicted myself, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you highlighted two very important points, which there were much more many points, but what resonated with me the most, first of all, it's intentionality. And that's also related to awareness. When we're intentional about what way we're planning to go and actually communicate our purpose and our why, then people around us have a choice to get on board with us.
Yeah. Look, also, am I interrupting you? Sorry. And that's LinkedIn live etiquette, is it? But
that's the conversation.
One of my real hates is when managers give that kind of feedback, like you're too intense or you're a bulldozer. I find that really infuriating, because that is not helpful, is it? You probably went home feeling really, I imagine, quite distressed at that. And we're talking about it many years later, so it's stuck in there somewhere. Because what does that actually mean? It's not helpful feedback, is it? It's very personal. And it's not actually saying, Tatiana, when you just spend a little bit more of your time bringing people with you, explaining how you want to work, slow down, pause, whatever, but they need to give you more helpful feedback than just you're too intense. Is that?
And that is important point. And look at this, what actually that created, because there is nothing bad or good in that. It's an energetic impact, right? And what does it exactly mean? And that's actually, you're totally right, for communication of the feedback. It's like, okay, what does it mean? And when is it good? When it leads to something that we're trying to create together? And when does it hinder something? And then you mentioned a very important point. First of all, like, it's distractions, that we are now having. And actually, what is interesting? I was interviewing one of the senior leaders in private equity on the subject of intensity, and he said, I actually have intense leaders who really, they cannot properly focus on one thing. They're focused on way too many things. And that's when it became very.
So what does he mean that they're intense then? How are they intense?
Right, because they are focused, but they're focused on too many things. So it's like, and that's why it's like my quadrant, which I've been thinking on, what is healthy intensity. And it's when we are, if you think of it on a horizontal axis, it would be trusting self, right? And on the vertical one, it would be purpose. So when we are connected with a clear purpose, then we can apply that energy in a very clear, directed, intentional way. When there are too many things that are important, then it kind of becomes like, focused on too many things, and it just eventually leads to burnout of self, burnout of others, right? So they are focused, but they're just focused on 10 things. Everything becomes important. And as Warren Buffett said, nothing is when everything is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And another important point you mentioned is neurodiversity, because yes, I think the perception of intensity is connected with the neurodiversity and the difference, how we come across. And now this is a subject which is much, much more openly discussed, and that has to be embraced as well in leadership, because that's what actually brings a diversity of views.
Yeah. And I'd never thought about intensity as having a toxic element. For me, I've just always thought it's wonderful to be able to work really intensely. That day before you go on holiday and you just get 2 weeks worth of work done in a day, you're totally focused. I always think if we could all work like that all the time, how much nicer life would be, because we'd get things done in a far more reasonable period of time than when we're switching from one task to another and distracted and, trying to do some intense work in a half an hour slice in between meetings, which is how most of us work. And it's pretty difficult. So I'd never thought about the toxic element. And so from the perspective of people listening into this, how can they catch themselves slipping over from healthy intensity into toxic intensity, and what should they do?
That's a very good question, Zina. And I believe, like cars, for example, they have indicators, right? Well, they have indicators that the water is running out or fuel is low. It's becoming clear what are actually your indicators like that. It might be somebody at home. It might be a friend who notices a particular look in your eyes, right? Or a particular reaction and says, oh, something is happening. Are you sure you are okay? It might be, it's basically, again, to have this intentional conversation and think, what is going to be your particular indicator? And sometimes, like, again, I love this metaphor with a car. We're looking in the rear view mirror, so it's easier to see what happened in the past, but that helps us reflect on what are potentially the signs. Like for me, when, because I think throughout my career in the city, I was both in healthy and in toxic intensity. And for me, the sign I remember was when I probably was getting stuck too much in a toxic intensity without noticing, is when I came home and the girls would just run away. Not like I didn't even need to say anything, right? So because they could feel this intense energy or something is going to, to happen now, which is going to hide for now, right? So, and that's a sign, and that's probably gone already too far.
Right. Okay. So is it that it's a lack of boundaries, that you've just given too much? That's what happens when you tip into toxic intensity, that you're giving up far too much of yourself and there's no reserves left.
Yeah, and it's a good point. For me, boundaries is probably something to always look at. That's my version exactly of intensity. And for somebody else, it would be something else. It might be, I have been working with a client for whom intensity goes into this extreme over-pleasing. And she is a senior leader. And yet, her version is she likes to be needed. And then it's gradually, resentment rises inside her. So it's about being aware what, if it is an intense person, what particular unique driver for that particular person, and what could be those indicators. So might be for you to reflect, are you always in a healthy intensity when you go into this intense periods of work? What could be your indicators potentially to slow down and get more into balance?
Yeah. So productivity, when people are kind of crazy busy, they work in deep, intense flow, hyper focus for a couple of hours a day. And then, I mean, it's impossible to work like that all day. It might be when you occasionally have to sprint through something and you take a few days to do it. But for most of us, you have periods of intensity and then you have a break and then you do something kind of low level, low stakes tasks. And then you go back to something that's intense. It's just kind of getting a mix. That seems to me quite healthy, and being aware of, the basics, isn't it? You need a good night's sleep and you need to look after yourself and you need to eat well and do all those absolute basics that we think we can outrun, but we can't.
That's right, exactly. And that's important to remember. And as we're coming to the end of half an hour, Zina, first of all, I want to thank you for being with me here today. And where can our listeners find you?
Thank you. So I'm Zina at zenaeverett.com. The Crazy Busy Cure is available from me in bulk and all good bookshops and Amazon. And my first book is a career manual called Mind Flip, Take the Fear Out of Your Career, which is now in its 3rd edition. So if you're getting it, make sure you get the red and yellow one, and that's on Amazon. And okay. So, and thank you, Tatiana. It's been really interesting talking to you. I'd never thought about this division between healthy and toxic intensity, so I shall look out for it.
Yes, and there will be a book coming on that subject. So,
and you've been interviewing. You've done a year's worth of interviews, haven't you?
That's right, and And
formative interviews. Yeah.
right. Thank you. And thank you so much for our listeners. And I see some comments here. So have a wonderful day and wonderful week, and see you in a month's time. Bye for now.